Good evening, everybody. I'm thinking maybe we ought to move the podium this way because most everybody is sort of in that direction tonight. But yeah, Kareem can just sort of move to the right, I guess. Our speaker tonight is Kareem Irfan. He served as the first Muslim president of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago, and as chairman of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago during the critical post-9/11 years. He is a lawyer and computer engineer, and he is at the Chicago-based, he's CEO of Crane Software, an international NMC group providing enterprise software, data analytics, and business intelligence solutions across Europe, the United States, India, and what's GCC?
The Gulf Cooperation and Council.
Ah, okay. I learned something new tonight. He leads Muslim Friday and Eid sermons at multiple mosques and served on more boards and councils than I will take time to list here because this is a list of them about this long. He is engaged in a range of interfaith advisory and implementation initiatives across the world and also served as chair of the Muslim American Advisory Council for the governor of Illinois and on the Chicago Council of Global Affairs Midwest Leadership Coalition on Immigration. We are delighted to have him here with us tonight. Let's welcome Kareem Irfan.
Good evening, folks. Good evening. Pastor Donahue, Pastor Lewis, and wonderful guests from all over here. Greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Great to hear that response. we have an informed audience tonight. I'll begin with a quote that probably will end up being familiar to you all. More than bricks and mortar mark the vibrancy of this congregation. Ring a bell to a few of the folks? That is straight out of the description of the history. The first congregational church here. Going back to the log cabin origins that you have. I pulled that out because that vibrancy is what brings us all together. The food pantry, the soup kettle, the pads work, the youth mission trips to serve the needy, that's going on under your congregation. It's that vibrancy that is so attractive and important. Your fantastic Super Bowl program. Collecting donations of money and food for the needy. Countering the materialism that is so rampantly associated with the NFL championship game. And countering that with caring, concern, and actions for those who are deserving of support and need. Talk about that vibrancy based on what I noticed, Dr. Donahue, your Make 2018 Great Again sermon. Guiding congregants to learn from the past, but look forward to a better future. Ride the horse in the direction it's going. The vibrancy that is represented by your focus here, the caring, the open arms focus on turning to anybody who shows up and saying, you're welcome here, no matter who you are. Welcoming somebody who looks different like me and my wife into your congregation. This, my dear friends, is the vibrancy that brings me to you tonight. And my wife and I are honored to be let into the beauty of, I consider this part of the sanctuary. To me, this is part of it. Because you can feel the tranquility, the presence of the Lord's representatives. And tonight I wish to engage with you all toward increased understanding, collaboration, and learning about each other. How we may better join hands toward a shared mission of building bridges of understanding in a world that is confronted with voices of divisiveness increasingly. And God willing, I'd like to leave here tonight with a shared purpose amongst us of riding your metaphorical horse, Dr. Donahue, in the direction it's heading, yet all of us together, perchance, guiding it a little gently, tugging at the reins collectively a little bit, so that we head toward what we collectively believe is a brighter and more peaceful destination. I stand before you as a fellow American, but also as one of 1.6 plus billion Muslims in the world today. They believe in one God. They believe in the prophets of God, including Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, the Messiah, and Muhammad. May the peace and the blessings of the Lord be upon all of them. Part of the 1.6 plus billion Muslims who believe in the books of God, the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran. They believe in the day of judgment and heaven and hell. I'm part of those 1.6 billion Muslims who pray, who fast, who give charity, who perform pilgrimage to the Holy Land, who promote the good and forbid the wrong. And it is particularly appropriate for this evening's gathering. We are into the new year. And I join you as a Muslim who's expected to live all of one's living moments in sincere thanksgiving to the Lord for the countless bounties showered upon us. As we promote the new year, we do take time to reflect upon what we've all been blessed with. And as a Muslim believer, a key requirement for me is the acknowledgement, the appreciation, indeed the celebration of the Lord's blessings. And one important segment of these invaluable gifts from the Lord are the treasures that are represented by each one of you here. So allow me to be a part of thanking the Lord for gathering us together in shared bonds of citizenship, morality, integrity, and mutual caring and compassion. In the tradition of Islam, we are reminded that thanksgiving was a distinguishing trait of all prophets, including Noah, Abraham, David, Jesus, Muhammad. We are expected to be grateful to not just the Lord, but to His creation, particularly for the support and fellowship of fellow human beings. The caution being from the Lord that he who does not thank people does not thank the Lord. With that in mind, and especially in view of all that the First Congregational Church of Elgin and its parent body, the United Church of Christ, serving as a model for progressive, all-inclusive, welcoming of people of diverse faiths, ethnicities, races, backgrounds, and nationalities, I tender my thanksgiving on behalf of myself and my wife, Rana, for being honored and for being welcomed here tonight into your holy sanctuary. And I tender gratefulness by welcoming you tonight and thanking you from the depth of my heart for your supportive presence. I know one of the fine ladies at the table that we were having a bite to eat spoke about the fact that the weather may have kept a few people from showing up tonight, and she thanked us for coming. And let me tell you, my dear sister in faith, I could not have been anywhere else tonight if I had a choice. Even if it were just one of you out here, would have been worth it. Because it is your caring relationships, your sincere friendships, and your bonds of togetherness which are forged and which will be strengthened on behalf of our shared principles and our common commitments and commitments to our communities, to our society and our country and our one world. That is the essence of what we are expected to be as the creation and the children of the Lord. So thank you, and thank you, and thank you. Today, this evening, I want to address 3 or 4 aspects. I know the time that you have allocated to me. Sherry, thank you for all the fine work you've done in making arrangements. It was good to finally see her. She's so efficient with her emails. And I can tell you that's the only way I survive, because I am privileged to be doing these interfaith activities, but where the paycheck through the Lord's will comes from is I've got to manage these multinational companies around the globe. And if you're not efficient at communications with email and WhatsApp, you just cannot survive. So it was such a pleasure. I've been traveling around just over the last 4 months since Sherry and I started engaging, but it was fun. We could set things up. We exchanged messages about the topic and my background and the agenda. Everything worked out perfectly. So heads up, thanks to Sherry for that. What I have learned, I don't know about the pastors or the rabbis in the audience here. I know there's at least one rabbi here. What I have learned is I give my Friday sermons every day. I've been privileged to do so for the last 3 decades. I go to different mosques. What I have learned is if you exceed 20 minutes, does that about sound right? 15 to 20.
My people say 6 minutes.
6? Oh, okay. Oh, wow, that's tougher. No. So,
1 minute left.
so I was told by...
The truth.
Yeah, there you go. So I keep my Friday sermons, no matter where I go to, I tell them 15 to 20 minutes and I'm off the stage. Because people are just about at the end of their patience at that point in time.
I go 15.
There you go. Makes sense. But tonight, for some reason, I've been allocated a little more time. But I can go on. And speaking to we could go on, right? But we could be done with a 15-minute sermon, and somebody says, I'm still interested. We could pull out another sermon. So we can go on. But what I will tell you is I want to address 2 or 3 topics, and I can stop anytime that Sherry or the doctor puts up your hand. So, but just to confirm the timing, then how much time do I have left?
6:30.
Okay, we won't go there, folks. Well, but I'll tell you what I'd like to do is make sure that we have more time for engagement. That I can tell you. I want to learn. I want to learn more than I have to contribute. I have very little that I can share in terms of wisdom. All I can do is share some of my experiences, but I can learn a lot more by just hearing you folks. So we can do that. But let me start out with the focus on interfaith relations and why that drives me for sure. These relationships between people of different faiths, they are a key aspect of the Islamic mission, and certainly my personal mission. One of our core teachings as Muslims is that God created us in nations and tribes so that you might know one another. That's a quote straight out of a verse of the Quran. And so that we might vie in doing good deeds. We are to be committed to working with people of all faith backgrounds and no faith backgrounds to promote shared values of mercy, justice, mutual understanding, and helping the most vulnerable amongst us. According to Islam, diversity is not just a fact of life, but it is divinely ordained as a core virtue. And the Quran states this: if God had so willed, chapter 5, verse 48 of the Quran, if God had so willed, he could have made you a single people. But his plan is to test you in what he has given you. So strive in all virtues and in doing good. To deny diversity then, for a Muslim, for people of all faith, I dare say, is akin to countering the purpose of creation. It is against the will of God who intended his creation to be diverse. So to put it more positively, then, it is the requirement of me fulfilling the purpose of God's diversity of creation, that I accept that diversity, that I nurture it, that I make the best of it, and test myself to see, am I doing what my Lord wanted me to do in promoting that diversity? Secondly, diversity has a specific purpose. In the Quran it is mentioned, and this is a verse that is often spoken about in the context of interfaith relations. O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes, so that you may know each other. The emphatic definition that you have differing nations and tribes. The Lord saying, we created you in that diversity. We know best. And then the understanding as to what is the purpose, so that you may know each other. The Arabic verse is fascinating, the word for getting to know each other. In fact, this whole verse is referred to as the verse of knowing. The word is ta'aruf. Knowing is a very simplistic translation of that word. It's a very comprehensive term that connotes understanding, getting to know, accepting, learning from, bonding with. So when I am told by the Lord that we are of different tribes and different nations, and that we have to know each other, my responsibility is to keep an open mind and accept that there are things about you that I wish I knew, that I could understand, so that I can become a better person, a better human being, a better servant to the Lord, and a better servant to his creation. And it is this foundation of getting to know each other that is to guide Muslims to relate to others in positive ways, to deepen understandings, to erase stereotypes, to overcome prejudices, and again, to strive and compete in doing good deeds. Today then, my friends, in a world which is increasingly divided, with differences exploited towards societal strife, interfaith gatherings like tonight, the campaign that you have put on, the Live Love, Stop Hate campaign, they are incredibly essential so that we may nourish the common ground and the understanding between fellow beings of diverse faiths. This is in line with the Quranic commandment to say, O people of the scripture, in the context of the monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, O people of the scripture, come to a common word as between us and you, that we worship none but God, and the biblical commandment to love God and one's neighbor. And that will be one of the bonding mechanisms that I am addressing today when we look at the topic of what I am addressing, and that is forging bonds of togetherness amongst our diversity of faiths. One core basis for shared peace and understanding exists as part of the very foundational principles of our faiths: love of the one God and love of the neighbor in terms of what the Lord has created. And these principles are found over and over again in our sacred texts. In the Quran, of God's unity, God says, say he is God, the one, God, the self-sufficient, besought of all, and of the necessity of love for God. Again, God says in the Quran, so invoke the name of thy Lord and devote thyself to him with complete devotion. Of the necessity of love for the neighbor, the Prophet Muhammad, and I'll address this a little bit more in detail today, when he said, none of you has faith until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. striking right at the heart of my faith. If I don't believe and act upon this, it tells me I'm not a believer. I'm not one of the faithful. I'm not a Muslim. Having grown up in India, one of the ladies that again at the table was asking me, and I was relating that I was born, I grew up there, I immigrated to this country roughly 35, 36 years ago. But having grown up in India and based on my interfaith work and initiatives across the world, I know that it's not just us, the monotheistic faiths or traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, but other faiths too, like Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism. They too share this concept of deep togetherness, which is based on shared concern for fellow creation. And with our common future at stake these days, with peace and stability of our communities and our cities and our country and perhaps the very survival of the world at stake, tonight is a good time to focus on how we may each be committed to better forging those bonds of understanding. And the factors along this hallowed path begin with this shared understanding of the love of God. I've shared the Quranic verses, and I'm literally preaching to the choir when I say, in the New Testament, the attribution to Jesus Christ. The first commandment, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, mind, and strength. And the second commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So we have that shared understanding, and particularly with respect to the U.C.C., the United Church of Christ. Allow me to share something directly out of the 1989 resolution from the 17th General Synod, addressing the relationship between the church and the Muslim community. The theological rationale that was given was that God calls the people of God to be agents of reconciliation, breaking down walls of division nationally, culturally, racially, and religiously. And the quote being directly out of Ephesians 2:11-18, you know that much better than I do. The underlying premise being that worship of the same God, the recognition of common prophets, a shared vision of God's justice, righteousness, compassion, and presence in the world is what bonds the communities of Christians and Muslims and Jews together. And the resolution went on to indicate that we share a common tradition of revelation through God's prophets, as told in sacred scripture, and a common belief in the compassion, justice, authority, and presence of God in human life and society. And specifically, the resolution ended with a call for all local congregations of the UCC to actively engage in dialogue with the Muslim community in order to establish relationships of trust and cooperation, and to participate in joint witness against all injustice in our local communities and in the world. So tonight we get a chance to discharge certain mutual obligations. We, the faithful, we believe that nothing happens by chance, and there is divine providence that brings us together. You, as members of the congregation, you get to discharge this directive. Increased mutual understanding between congregants and people of fellow faith from the Muslim community. I and my wife, we get to discharge a fundamental obligation that I have of getting to know people of other faiths better and recognizing a sense of humility that there is much to be learned that can better me and my wife and ourselves in the path of the Lord. So let us keep that in mind as we move on from the love of God to focusing on the love of neighbors. That is very critical because a stable society is premised on a system of interdependence of individuals. As a Muslim, I can state that Islam lays great importance on keeping balance in a community through peace and care among one another, especially in the case of neighbors. Islam's code of life, just like that for our faith represented here, Christians and Jews, it promotes harmony amongst people. The Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of the Lord be upon him, exhorted Muslims to be good to their neighbors and to honor them. When he said, whoever believes in Allah, whoever believes in God and the last day should serve his neighbor generously. In fact, under the Sharia, the much maligned term in today's context, that is so misunderstood, it is a body of overall Islamic regulations. According to that, loving goodness for one's neighbors is considered a part of faith, as I've alluded to earlier. And it is remarkable that this focus on the rights of neighbors is absolutely independent of their faith. It's important for me to be reminded and to pass that on to you, friends. The Prophet said, the best companion in the sight of the Lord is the one who is best to his companions. And the best neighbor in the sight of the Lord is the one who is the best to his neighbor. And he was particular about leaving out any reference to the specific faith of the individuals at stake. Neighbors are neighbors, independent of whether they are Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists or Sikhs, or those with no faith at all. And beyond those broad ideals, then Muslims are expected to follow specific practical acts in pursuit of righteousness, in pursuit of togetherness. And these include returning greetings from one another and accepting invitations. It's one of the most important ways of respecting a neighbor that I'm told when somebody greets you, try to get back to them with a better greeting. That's one of the reasons the lady who responded to Assalamu alaikum, that's what Assalamu alaikum stands for, is may the peace and blessings of the Lord, may the peace of the Lord be upon you. And the expectation for a Muslim is, I cannot, if there is one thing that a Muslim can do to make another Muslim speak to him or her, it is this. All I have to hear is Assalamu alaikum from anybody, be it my worst enemy. It is my obligation to respond with at least that level of peace, or preferably making it better. So the tradition, when I say Assalamu alaikum, may the peace of the Lord be upon you, the response is Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. That is, the same peace be upon you and the blessings of the Lord. And then if that person takes that a step further, he or she responds with something better. And it's a cycle of compassion and caring that is expected to take place. Looking at neighbors then, I'm trying to squeeze that into the time here. So I'll rush through this part a little bit. Refraining from hurting neighbors, inconveniencing or harming them. Bearing the harm of a neighbor with tolerance. Concern for a neighbor's welfare and needs, sharing gifts and meals, guarding the honor of neighbors. All of these have specifically been addressed by the Prophet of Islam as being part of the rights of neighbors. And there are some that I think I would like to relate. For instance, the messenger of the Lord said, "He who spends the night satiated while knowing that his next door neighbor is hungry does not believe in me." The understanding for a Muslim, this is a tough one that I grapple with. We speak about this often, my wife and our children. The understanding for a Muslim is he or she is responsible for at least 40 houses around one's residence. That's the minimal definition of a neighbor. I know for a fact I fall way short of adhering to that. 40 houses, it's not easy, folks. Just 2 around on the left and the right, I don't do that enough. Because what this tells me, there is a tradition of the Prophet that says that when you cook your food at home as a Muslim, if the aroma of my food wafts over to my neighbor, and that neighbor does not have food in his or her house, then I have caused him distress and I am accountable for that as a sin. Tough, high standard for me to take into account. And again, independent of whether the neighbor is a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a non-believer, the fact that there is proximity, there is some connection, in creation we have that relationship. And sometimes we get caught up in how pious one is, how often I go back to the word of the Lord and I recite the sacred scripture and I go to church or the mosque often. But all of that is kept as a personal connection to the Lord, but does not lessen the burden that I have to treat my neighbors with care. And there is this tradition when the Prophet of Islam was approached about a lady, and people said, there is this woman who performs prayers all night and fasts during the day, but she offends her neighbors with her tongue. And the Prophet's response was very, very striking. He said, there is no good left in her. He said, he does not enter paradise whose neighbor is not secure from his evil. In view of such traditions, it is historically related by the Prophet Muhammad when he said, I received so many obligations through inspiration through the Archangel Gabriel about the rights of neighbors. He said, I was sure that pretty soon my neighbors would be given the right of inheritance in my property. He expected that to happen, because that was the logical move. All of these concerns to take care of them, and when you die, well, you don't just get absolved. They get a share of something of what you've left behind, possibly. So I bring that up with one important point to be noted. Now, the thought that comes up is, okay, if there is all this scripture and the traditions of the Prophet on concern of neighbors, why are there Muslims out there who don't care? Now I can turn that question around and say, why aren't there Christians who are not following everything that they are expected to? Why aren't there Jews who are doing that? The point here is, this is what Muslims are expected to do. Do I do all of that? No. Am I going to be accountable for it? Yes. Do I expect to be absolved for it? I don't know. All I can do is pray and hope and keep doing the good. But the point I do want to relate to you is, these are uncontroverted commandments and teachings of Islam. And that is what Muslims are expected to be. And the counterpart teachings in Judaism and Christianity. If we were to focus upon that, the differences are going to become less prominent in our sights. Okay, with the love of God and the love of neighbors having been addressed, let me move on to a concept that I feel is very important as we try to work together. And that is a shared focus on truth. Because that concept is under attack. Oxford Dictionary's 2016 Word of the Year, post-truth. Post-truth, as in having a meaning more like belonging to a time in which the specified concept here, truth, has become unimportant or irrelevant. We are talking about truth having become unimportant in social discourse. And as an aside, the 2017 Collins Dictionary Word of the Year, fake news.
Fake news.
The next time you bring me back, we'll talk about that. But today, let's talk about truth, because there is a significant relationship to our faith and what the Lord expects from us. Because we face an assault today on that truth which Horace Mann showed us as a path to greatness when he said, if any man seeks for greatness, let him forget greatness and ask for truth, and he will find both. We seem to have gone past that. Today, under siege is that truth which Justice Holmes described as, truth is tough, it will not break like a bubble at a touch. You may kick it about all day like a football, and it'll still be round and full at evening. That seems to be from days bygone, right? From the religious viewpoint, then, we must understand that absolute truth is part of the divine. Perfect knowledge of all truth about all things, omniscience. It is regarded by major faiths, especially the Abrahamic traditions, as a core attribute of the divine Lord. And truth is most often understood to mean being in accord with reality, fidelity to a high original standard, an idea of authenticity, truth to self. And there is the understanding that truth is linked to reality and true existence of something. Let me cover the Islamic perspective on truth, so that you understand where I'm coming from. In the Quran, the Lord commands, O you who believe, have fear of God and be amongst the truthful. So the commandment to know, understand, be aware of the Lord is immediately tied to being amongst the truthful. And truthfulness is defined as a core prescription for a believer to attain the pleasure and the love of the Lord. And God has made clear in the Quran that telling the truth is a way for attaining success and salvation on the day of judgment. This is confirmed in a verse which says, this is the day of judgment. This is the day when the truthful shall benefit from their truthfulness. For them are gardens beneath which rivers flow and all of that. But the emphatic ending to that verse is, this is the magnificent triumph. So the salvation that we all seek, according to Islam and to Muslims, it is tied directly to recognizing what is the truth and then acting upon the truth. And we are reminded as Muslims that truthfulness was an essential attribute of every prophet who graced the earth. And mentioned in the book Abraham, the Quran says, surely he was the most truthful prophet. And mentioned in the book Ishmael, surely he was a man true to his word, and he was a messenger, a prophet. And mentioned in the book Enoch, surely he was the most truthful prophet. We also read in the Quran how a man who was incarcerated alongside the prophet Joseph at a time when he was split apart from his family, he refers to him and says, Joseph, O most truthful one. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was particularly declared as being truthful in the words of God in the Quran. Where the Quran says, the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, his mother was a truthful one, a believer. And Muslims are reminded of the Prophet Muhammad's high virtue of truth, when his wife addressed him saying, I swear by Allah that he will never disgrace you, for you are kind to your kith and kin, and you speak only the truth. And as I conclude this focus on truth, let me focus on one important aspect. That truthfulness is far more than bearing an honest tongue. Truthfulness is the conformity of the outer with the inner, the action with the intention, the speech with the belief, and the practice with the preaching. And hence, truthfulness demands reflection and responsive actions. I cannot subscribe to the truth if I just say, I listen to it and say, that's truthful. That's the beginning part. If I appreciate and understand the truth, then I have a duty and an obligation to stand up for what that truth demands of me. I may have to take some action upon that truth. That's when I am part of the truth. So it is something to be cultivated and practiced. And practical aspects are important in this regard. There is a tradition of the prophet where we are reminded, where he said, whoever does 3 things with regard to people, they are obliged to 3 things for him, and they lead to salvation. Whenever he speaks to them, he is truthful. Whenever they entrust him with something, he does not betray their trust. And whenever she promises them something, she fulfills it. And if this is done, then their hearts will open out with love for him, their tongues will praise him, and they'll come to his aid. I bring that up, ladies and gentlemen, because so often these days, particularly as I go around the world on my business travels and my interfaith initiatives, I come across this acceptance of truth, but then a passive response to the truth. Because that's easier for me. It's easier for me to notice something that is said on television that is vile and false about something, and to say, that's horrible, and then just not do anything about it. When we come across truth, this action that follows the truth is so significant that we need to take account of. And I leave you with that reminder. For instance, the meal that we have shared tonight, the 20 minutes, half an hour of discourse that we have, the least that we would all be under an obligation would be to say, hey, the next time we are in a gathering and there is this speech about all Muslims are terrorists, I would expect that there is a reaction from some of you that say, hey, you know what? I saw at least 2 people who said they were Muslims who did not seem like terrorists. I say that with all seriousness, ladies and gentlemen. Because that is what I expect to do, is pass on the word so that we can all stand up and say, hey, hang on. Let's talk about this. I'm not going to let you get away with that. And the same thing as we see what's happening now in Poland. Rampant anti-Semitism. It's easy for me just to sit here and say, yes, that's going on there, but I can tell you, in a couple of weeks, I'll have to be traveling to Abu Dhabi and Qatar as part of the business, maybe, and that conversation is going to come up. If I shut up and just sit down and not speak up and say what is happening is wrong, this cannot go on, this targeting of our Jewish brothers and sisters in faith, I am not a truthful one then if I just sit back and listen and accept it. So let us acknowledge that there is an obligation to act upon this truth whenever that comes up. I never leave I beg your pardon. There should be nothing more important than this. I thought I'd shut that down. There we go. That's a call from India. Something must be going on there. Oh, this is India. Some of the companies I'm responsible for. Yeah?
Time up, maybe it was a signal.
Oh, there we go. No, I still have 7 minutes. Thank you. Boy, we are all accountable to our spouses, aren't we? Thank you, my lady. So, as I conclude on this aspect of truth, brothers and sisters in faith, we are under strong obligations to search for, to recognize, to reflect upon, and to act upon the truth. We are also under obligation to counter falsehood and lies to the best of our abilities. We have much to do together in both speaking and reflecting these truths, in harnessing the power of truth to address society's myriad problems in reliance upon our diversity of faiths and our shared values. And sincere recognition of these truths will guide us to responsive actions in so many areas. Fighting the scourge of radicalization and violent extremism in our communities and in our youth. Uplifting the poor, the oppressed minorities, and the disadvantaged. Countering crimes and drug addiction, especially amongst the youth. Strengthening the institution of family. Protecting our physical environment from pollution. Promoting social justice for all. And then acting together against religious, sectarian, ethnic prejudices, discriminations, and conflicts. Let me emphasize, these are not just social, economic, and political issues. Let me emphasize that again. We cannot just let these be covered by politicians and governments while subject to deceptions of alternate facts, of fake news and corrosive spin. Instead, as people of faith, we must recognize these truths as part of universal truths and values, which form the ethical, the moral, and indeed the spiritual fabric of a religiously informed society and its concerned and guided citizens. So as I end today, I want to go back to where I started. The fact that we are a diversity of backgrounds, of faiths. Last month, I was privileged to speak at Mayor Rahm Emanuel's Dr. Martin Luther King Interfaith Breakfast. And I reminded myself and the audience there that we sit on a mother lode of richness based on our diversity. And I reminded us all, was it not diversity that was summoned as Dr. King dreamed of the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners being able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood? Was it not diversity that was being appealed to as he looked up to a time when his children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character? Was it not diversity that was at the core when he called for freedom to ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, to arrive at a day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, "Free at last." Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. For sure, a core belief resonating across Dr. King's initiatives was that diversity is indeed the strength of this great nation. We are blessed with diversity of race, of religion, of culture, of gender, of age, of national origin, even of socio-economic backgrounds. Diversity of races and religions is in fact an American tradition. And anyone visiting early America would have faced a dazzling array of whites, blacks, and browns, and a complex spectrum of faith groups. Catholics, Protestants, Quakers, Mennonites, Calvinists, along with pockets of Jews and scores of Native American tribes independent of any church. And then you can add to those the 20% of all slaves who were brought to the United States who were Muslims. So keeping all of that in mind, then, ladies and gentlemen, I end with this focus. Again, we can attribute to Dr. King when he spoke about action. Remember his drum major speech. Fantastic to just be reminded of that. He said, tell them to not mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That is not important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That is not important. Instead, Dr. King said, when speaking about what should be said about him after he passed away, he said, I would like them to mention that Martin Luther King tried to give his life serving others. That MLK tried to love somebody. That MLK tried to feed the hungry. He said, I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity, and that if you wish to say I was a drum major, say I was a drum major for peace, a drum major for righteousness, and then all of the other shallow things shall not matter. In pursuit of that exemplar of service to humanity, we must draw upon our respective faiths, ladies and gentlemen. For surely each of these aspects requires us to understand, to love, serve, and care for our fellow beings, regardless of their religion or race. Especially then, as forces abound, which use misinformation and demagoguery to ply hate and vitriol, to divide us into factions questioning, opposing, and hating each other, we have cause for action. We, the faithful of compassion and tolerance, must forge relationships of mutual concern. Let us, to ride Dr. Donohue's horse once again, let us ride our horse together in that direction of shared love, of understanding, and peace. Together, may the Lord be with all of us. Amen. Thank you. On time, Mrs. Irfan, are you happy? Of course, I can shake hands with you and take off, but I've got to live with the lady, and she has to be satisfied and happy.
We have some time for Q&A.
Yes. Or comments, or I just want to learn from your experience.
I'll
Yes.
start with a question.
Okay, ma'am, 1, 2.
What are the 3 pillars of Islam?
Okay, there are 5 of them.
Oh, okay, the 5.
But-
I want to hear all 5.
Right? But it begins with the testimony of faith. The faith is the first pillar, which indicates that I have to acknowledge that the Lord is the sole creator of all creation to whom I am answerable to. And there is a component to it that says I acknowledge that the Prophet Muhammad was his final messenger. And then after the faith, then there is the obligation to pray. Pray 5 times a day. I'm expected to turn to the Lord and go through ritual prayer and then ask the Lord for guidance. And then after that, beyond that, I'm expected to also fast during the month of Ramadan, fast between sunrise and sunset, and adopt that level of fasting during some other times of the year too. Then there is the concept of zakat, identical to zakat in the Jewish tradition, where I'm expected to be kind at all times and give from what the Lord has given me. But beyond that, there is a set percentage that every Muslim, roughly about 2.5% of your savings are expected to be given to those in need. And then the final pillar being, when you can afford to, during your lifetime, you make the pilgrimage to Mecca, where you circumambulate and do some ritualistic prayers around the house that incidentally, people forget this part about the pilgrimage. The belief being that was the first house that was ever built on earth at the solicitation of the Lord directly to Abraham and his son. And they completed the house. And so Muslims are expected to make that pilgrimage. So those are the 5 pillars. But what is important, though, is where, again, I go back to the traditions covering neighborliness. Yes, if I miss my prayers, if I don't fast, I'm sinning. But that is a relationship between me and my Lord. And the understanding is that the Lord in His mercy may forgive me, and we hope and pray that He does. But the understanding also is, if I take away from the rights of the creation, if I mistreat you, for instance, Muslims are told that salvation can only come if I am able to compensate for the ill that I've done to you, and not just directly through the Lord. So that extends it. So that's what I wanted to pass on. Ma'am, you were...
Yes. In the Christian tradition, there are what I call crazy Christians, you know, the ones that the Westboro Baptist Church that goes and does all those very strange things. Inside of your tradition, you have people who are doing things as well. What does the progressive and accepting part of your faith do to somehow, I guess, set yourself apart, communicate with, stand in opposition to the people who are doing things, I mean, blowing up mosques and all of that? How do you reconcile that?
Well, there is no reconciliation with the faith. The stance has to be quite unequivocal in making it clear that based on the tenets of the faith, these actions are outside the precepts of Islam. So the example that comes to my mind is I happen to be the chairman of the Council of Islamic Organizations here during the September 11th, post-September 11th area. In fact, I was driving to a meeting of international C-level executives, and this happened. So we went in there, I had that meeting, and then I had to present a report to our global CEO, and immediately I said, please excuse me from the rest of the meeting because I have to go craft a statement against what has happened. Because I was representing the entire body of Muslims in the Chicago area, at that time 400,000 or so. So we had to immediately craft a statement that said these actions are outside the fold of Islam. Islam does not justify any such killing. There is no justification whatsoever. So those types of statements come out by the leadership, of course, all over. But there is an element of your question which is difficult in the sense, how do you deal with those people when you come across them? Thankfully, in our part of the world, we don't get too much exposure directly to them, thankfully. But what we try to do here, I do come across those in my international travel, so we can talk about that. But what I'll tell you of more relevance, what happens here in the mosques, in the Islamic schools or so, we are very particular to make sure those teachings are highlighted, so that the youth are equipped. Our children, when they were young, they were growing up at that time, we made sure we had discussions to say, why is this level of killing, or any killing, why is that not part of the fold of Islam? Why are the misinterpreted verses of the Quran that these people are using as justifications, why are they totally off base? And we try to do that. But there will always be those who preempt the sacred scripture, and according to the wisdom of the Lord, all our scriptures have these areas which can be hugely misinterpreted.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, and then me.
I've lived in a number of Muslim countries, several of which are being torn apart at the moment as those who espouse the type of Islam that I believe you adhere to are being challenged violently by those who espouse a more nihilistic view of Islam.
Sure.
Why is that happening, and what do you see as the outcome?
Wow, that's a great question. We'll have to follow up in detail along that. But what is in the recent turn of events, let me just address that. When you speak about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all of those, they had their own distorted, warped understandings, but they were relying upon discontent in social context to build upon it, saying, okay, you have youth who have no lives to look forward to, unemployment being rife, and then they latch on to some cause such as what's happening in Palestine, and then say, what can we just use to rile up emotions and build upon that? But what is happening of late is the Muslim countries, I mean, you look at Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi and Qatar and the like, they are Muslim countries, but they are monarchies, as we know. And so there is always this overriding sense of personal well-being that they are looking after. So everything has to be taken in that context too. But your question is very relevant in terms of how do the Muslims who are mainstream in their understanding, how do they keep countering those perspectives? Within the Muslim world, what I can tell you is when I go to India or other parts of the world and sit with the Muslim communities, what is fascinating to me is you never find any acceptance for these. I mean, I know it sounds like a self-serving statement, but it is almost negligible when I come across people saying, you know what, that is the interpretation that makes sense, let's follow it. But the question is, how do we give voice to the moderate, the mainstream perspectives, and that remains a challenge. So, could we go with the lady? She had her hand up first.
I just think it's important if you could explain two things. That you have the 10 Commandments in the Quran, right?
Oh, we have the equivalent of those. It's not set as the 10 Commandments, but we have the equivalent, yes.
And could you explain to everybody the difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis and the breakdown of those
Okay,
parts?
well, without getting into details, the Shias and the Sunnis, the vast majority of the Muslim population around the world, roughly around 80% or so, they are the Sunnis. The Shias, about the third generation of the Muslim rulers after the Prophet Muhammad, there was a split that came up based on whether his son-in-law, right, should be the leader of the community at that time, or should should the leadership go on the basis of collective consultation? Those Shias are the ones who believe it should have continued through the bloodline of the Prophet. And so the Shia the word Shia literally means the supporters or the party of Ali, who was the person that we are talking about. So that is the distinction. Theologically, there isn't a fundamental difference, but then there are differences that come as to who do they continue to believe is the current leader of the Muslim community in the world. So then we can get into more. So that's what is happening. So according to the Shia tradition, there are imams, as they say, leaders who have come in succession through history, and they believe those are the ones who should be followed. And according to the mainstream, the Sunni perspective, there is no designated succession based on lineage of the Prophet. So that's, yes, sir.
The three major religions that we're talking about, and every religion I've ever read about, are all used at different times in history to justify all kinds of slaughters, whether it was the Canaanites being slaughtered or Crusades or wherever you want to go. So now we've been fed a generation of propaganda to equate Muslim and terrorist. So you think Muslim, you think terrorist. You see a terrorist, you think Muslim. So my question is perhaps a little difficult. Mm-hmm. It's like there are madrasas, schools, in which all they teach is the Quran, which have been funded by many sources, including the Saudi royal family, have spent billions of dollars funding these schools. There must be, I assume there's something in the Quran that is being used to justify their version of it. Mm-hmm. Just as I'm Jewish, just as in the Old Testament, it's you could argue that it's God's will that the chosen people should have slaughtered the Canaanites.
Sure.
Not my particular brand of religion, but it's used for earthly reasons. My question is really gets to what is there in the Quran that they can make use of to justify these things? And if there were a Christian minister here and a rabbi here addressing this question, I would hope I would have the truthfulness to ask them the same thing, because I really like what you said about truth.
Sure. Well, I'll address your question, but I will also add a little bit to what it means to us today, with your permission. There are a bunch of verses that can be interpreted in terms of being violent towards those who are opposing the Muslim community. And if you take them outside the context of Revelation and the time in which these were revealed, it becomes easy to apply that. But when you take those very verses in the context of when were they revealed, if they were applicable to a particular time frame and the particular opposition that was being faced, then they become tempered. And the same is the case with so many verses in the Torah and in the Old and the New Testaments and the like. But what I would like to focus us on is the relevance of the verses in our faiths, which go way beyond the focus on violence and extremism, and instead focus on the compassion and the caring that is attributable to the Lord, and hence a minuscule aspect of that at least being reflected in our own lives, so that our lives become transformed here. Yes, today there are verses of the Quran that I could sit on and say, let's think about those and in what context do they apply. But it's much easier for me. There are hundreds, those verses that could be misinterpreted. There may be a few or 10 or 15. But at the same time, the whole of the Quran, for instance, it has 6,600 and roughly 60 verses or so. The overwhelming majority of those focus on the mercy of the Lord, focus on the need to serve humanity in a way to serve the Lord. They focus on the rights of the neighbors, for instance. And when there are such crystal clear obligations that tell me if I don't take care of my neighbor, I may not be a full believer or a Muslim, that tells me immediately I can worry about those other verses a little bit later on. But today, what can I do and what should I be doing? So my lifetime of work is dedicated to just focusing on not shelving those differences, recognizing those differences will always be there, but let's keep them aside for a while. Instead, let's focus on what binds us together as fellow beings, as fellow creation, as fellow people of faith who are committed to our understanding of the truth and our obligations to each other. And that's what I want to leave us all with today. The time that we have spent, you could have been anywhere else doing much better than being here in what most people would consider a dull time here, not exciting food or drinks around. We spoke about that this is a hill where we've got 10 or 12 holy places around here for worship here, and then there was the other perspective that there used to be as many or if not more bars around, so we could have all been bar hopping tonight. But there is a reason the Lord, and lest I become too arrogant in thinking, oh my God, because I happen to be the past chairman of the council, I'm feted here and you have accepted me here and you are garlanding me and doing all that. No, I have to be simplistic enough and humble enough to realize that it was the choice of the Lord that He picked each one of us to be away from those distractions and to be in this sanctuary tonight, to come here with an open mind and an open heart and to shake hands and hope that our hearts will get together, that we will overcome some of the prejudices that are prevalent out there, that we will overcome the demagoguery that is outside with the power of our understanding and our love and our caring. So today when we leave here, folks, I beg of you, and this is a phrase that I use in all my interfaith talks, once we have gathered together in this umbrella of the Lord's faith, we are all ambassadors. We are all ambassadors of goodwill. We are all ambassadors of togetherness. And an ambassador has an obligation. So that when we go out there tonight, let's go back to our friends and relatives and say, hey, you know what? You missed out on a gathering. It's not the talk that I gave, the fact that we were able to come together. It was significant, and that we spread this word of togetherness, and that we can bring about change. And the Lord knows change is needed. So, Reverend Donahue, yes, that horse is going forward in its direction, but man, we don't want to just sit on it and say, take me wherever you want. I know that's not what you meant. But what I'm saying is, let's be prepared to understand which direction we are going in, and it's a shared peace that we are seeking, but we all have to put our hands together on the reins and tug at it here and there, so that together we may end up in that destination of peace and love and compassion. So that is our obligation. Let's go out and do the good work, folks. Thanks for having us here.
Kareem, my mind is just reeling from all kinds of things. You know, I have, for years and years, I have said one of my criteria for a good sermon is how many sermons it generates in me, and I've got a slew of them tonight. So thank you so much. And you know, you talked about how you only have like, what, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. I grew up a Baptist. And we come from a tradition that says you finish when you get through. I want to thank you so. I guess no. Well, it doesn't work here either. It strikes me that, and you know, the folks in my congregation have heard me say this ad nauseum, but I'm going to say it again. One of the things that we have to do is to reclaim our scriptures for ourselves. I am sick and tired of the Westboro Baptist Church and other people of that ilk talking about this is the biblical view. You know, and we always say, well, that's not who we are. I say, I know, but the folks out there don't know that. They think that that's who we are. And increasingly, that's who they think that we are. So I want to say that I'm always impressed, Kareem, with your, I'll let you take a picture. Okay. I'm always impressed with people like you who know your scriptures so well. And I want to encourage our folks to become like that. You know, I mean, I'm so tired of the right-wing nut jobs being the only ones who are the biblical voices out there. Folks like us tend to quote the latest newspaper article or the sociological study or whatever. Unless we can reclaim our scriptures for ourselves and do ourselves what Kareem was just doing with his own holy scriptures, we're sunk. It will not work. We have to be our own people of the book. So thank you, Kareem, for reminding us of that. The only other thing I'll say, too, is that somebody years and years ago said the problem with a lot of people in dealing with the Bible is they treat it like an ironing board. That every part is exactly as important as any other part. And I think that's what you were getting at when you were talking about those problematic verses. You know, there's no reason for me to put Paul saying that a woman should keep her head covered in church on the same level with Paul saying in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. So anyway, and we could discuss all night long, and I really would love to, you know, different interpretive strategies and that sort of thing. But we have to be more proactive. And I loved what Kareem had to say about the next time somebody starts spouting off some of this hatred, speak up. We don't have to respond with our own hatred.
Right,
That just adds to the hatred.
right.
But we can say, you know, I met this guy named Kareem Irfan, and he's as far away from a terrorist, as far away from what you're talking about as night is from day. You know, that's doing truth. It sure is. Thank you for being here. Thanks again to Rich. The food was magnificent as usual as he carries his pots and pans up the stairs. Next week we have a speaker from the ACLU talking about transgender issues, particularly why are transgender people still fighting for their lives in this day and time. So come back next week, bring your friends and neighbors, and we'll see you then. Thank you.